You've probably seen a lot of developers switching from Claude Code to Codex. This has been going on for a while. It's kind of the new Mac versus PC debate. So I want to talk about how it looks if you're an existing Claude Code user to switch to Codex. I'll show you the differences in configuration and workflow, and also the difference in how you interact and talk to these models to get real work done. Now let's start by just talking about all the options available in each of these tools, or CLI harnesses, you might call them. Now, starting with slash commands, they're about the same, just with different names. In Claude Code, you can have a side conversation with slash BTW, and in Codex is slash side. In Claude Code, you can say how long you want it to think with slash effort, and in GPT, it's tied to the models themselves with slash model. You also have access to skills, MCP servers, and everything else. Now, in Claude, if you want to explicitly call a skill, you also use a slash command, while in Codex, you use a $sign to discern skills versus harness actions. Small difference, but it tripped me up for the first couple days. Now, I will call out a couple skills built into Codex that require some custom config in Claude. One of them is a built-in OpenAI docs tool to quickly ask questions about how to use OpenAI. Claude knows how to use Claude as well. I just appreciate the explicit skill here. Codex also has a built-in skill for browser use that lets it create a browser and move a cursor around. It's pretty freaking cool. Claude Code has a Chrome extension that lets you control Chrome with Claude, which is roughly the equivalent here. But really, it's just been a game of tit for tat between each of these. By the time this is uploaded, I wouldn't be surprised if there are equivalent skills for browser use in Claude, for example, or if some of the names on skills shifts around over time. As for configuration, it's a similar story. Codex supports all the fundamentals of Claude Code, which are skills, MCPs, and hooks, with subtle differences in how they're written and gaps in coverage for each of those. For example, not all of Claude's hooks are supported, though the fundamental ones that I lean on, like pre-tool use, are. And you also can't use Claude's slash commands inside of Codex, although you should probably be migrating slash commands to skills anyways. If you're wondering if those gaps will meaningfully impact your workflow, I would just use Codex to migrate the configuration over and see where the gaps are. If you open up the Codex app, there is an explicit place to migrate from existing tools like Claude Code, which might be the cleanest way to do it, but you can also just ask the agent to migrate for you. In my case, I asked it to migrate both the Claude Code config in this project and also globally, and asking it to create symlinks for anything that is identical between the two setups, so I don't have to manage two duplicates of the same thing. This last part is crucial if your team is using a mixture of tools. I expect at this point it's fairly common for members of a company or a small team even to be using Codex for some tasks and Claude Code for others, so it's best to make sure your setup is as aligned as possible for both of these tools. Now, symlinks are just a way to maintain a copy of a file that always gets updated whenever the source file changes. And you can set them up at the directory level or at the file level so that any configuration you add to your Codex setup gets copied back to Claude Code. The main place you can set that up is for skills that you install or for an agents.md, which is how Codex defines rules, and making sure they copy back to Claude.md for your Claude Code setup. If you ever install skills from a third party, you can use the skills CLI to do all that symlinking stuff for you. I use this tool, skills.sh. It's a really convenient way to install skills from a GitHub repository. And whenever you select a skill that you want to use, you can decide whether to copy it over to Claude Code, as I've selected here. And this will set up a symlinks that's available across all of your agents. As for agent rules, you could just ask an agent to set all this up for you. I just asked Codex to migrate some Claude Code files for me, and it was able to find the equivalent for all the hooks configuration, symlinking files that are similar, and then also making sure any updates to the agents MD gets copied back to Claude. The last thing I'll note is how customizable these harnesses are. In the end, Claude Code is still kind of the king of customization. A strong example is the status line that you get at the bottom of your Claude Code setup. You can set up custom scripts to show whatever you want here. I set up one myself to show me how much context was added for every prompt that I send it, which is kind of useful for me to evaluate, did I ask it to do too much research or things like that. In Codex, you can't customize the status bar this heavily. You can decide which things you want to show. They have a number of configurable options. But for context, for example, you can only use their built-in display mode. You can't really hack it like you can in Claude Code. But in the end, I would treat these as very similar tools with different muscle memory, slightly different configuration, but roughly the same ways to do things across both of them. You just might be missing some of the fancy features in Claude Code like custom status bars, a built-in voice mode, gaps in the Claude marketplace versus the Codex marketplace that you might notice, really that last 2 to 3% of feature set. Now let's talk about how it feels to prompt and get things done with these agents. Since the day-to-day experience of talking to them is going to be the biggest difference you notice. So in Claude Code, the thing that got me and a lot of other people hooked is how it just kind of understands what you're asking for with very minimal prompting. For example, asking Claude to generate a plan to improve the SEO of my current site, it just kind of whipped up a planning document when I set it to planning mode, and it was good enough for me to have a conversation with it or ask it to implement right away. And of course, if you do want it to ask clarifying questions, you can use the interactive planning mode to get there. Now in Codex, you can also get to working solutions from any prompt, but you'll find that it takes your wording a lot more literally than Claude Code might. For example, I was working with Codex on a notes app that I'm building, and I told it an edge case that I noticed inside of our editor. It was able to create a test case against that and write a code change that worked the first try. Love test-driven development. But you'll notice that it only captured that single test case and used the wording word for word even when it was kind of filler content that didn't really matter. If I describe what I want, it'll do it exactly, but it won't really infer many details beyond that. Another thing I've noticed is when it's worth reaching for planning mode versus not. In my experience, I've always needed to use Claude in planning mode whenever we're researching a topic, since I've found, especially with the latest batch of models, that it will not reach for research until you ask for it or if your prompt is kind of explicit. Here I was asking it for differences between the models, for example, and I had to prompt it a little bit further to get it into researching mode. Plan mode is kind of the way to nudge it in that direction, to expand the knowledge base before you start working on something. Codex, meanwhile, has been a lot more proactive with researching in my experience. To be honest, I never use planning mode, although it does exist as an equivalent in the Codex harness. As a practical example, this is how I talked to Codex to implement a larger engineering task. Here I was exploring what it would look like to migrate from one library to another in the Notes app that I'm building. And in Claude Code, I might reach for planning mode in order to do this, but in Codex, I just prefer long conversations with voice mode to capture as much context as possible. So when it takes that chef's knife and cuts into the task, it has all the information it needs to do it correctly. And I don't reach for the planning mode toggle. I've been keeping it on medium reasoning on the latest GPT 5.5 model. I won't speak too much to when you should switch reasoning levels, but in my experience, I just keep it the same. And then I got to a working solution all within the same chat thread. I found that Codex does a good job of researching the codebase as well as the web without me prompting or using explicit modes, so this workflow is more than enough for me. And you'll notice whenever I'm prompting it, I am kind of prompting like an engineer guiding a task. I have a decent handle on libraries, and I try to, for example, describe what part of the codebase I want it to look at so that it always grabs the right thing into context. Here I'm talking about a library that I know of and the function name where I want it to evaluate. And at each turn, I use this strategy, and I'm able to get one step closer towards my goal. In general, I find that Codex really rewards this approach of going step by step through requirements, rather than jumping to a working solution and then filling in gaps, which tends to be the Claude Code workflow. I would sum up the difference in how I used to prompt versus how I prompt with Codex with this chart. Now, of course, there are strategies in both sides that could be interchanged between the agents, but this is what the happy path has sort of steered me towards, and it might steer the way that you prompt these as well. So whenever I use Claude Code, I would always start in planning mode, give a vague ask, and then let the research and discussion process drive us towards a good solution. Usually a step-by-step plan with different phases to implement. And then we might work through those step-by-step or jump to the working solution and work through edge cases and code quality through QA to get to something good. This is nice because Claude Code fully supports this workflow and it makes it approachable, especially to newer developers. Now, when using Codex, I've found myself jumping to a bit more of an explicit workflow. First off, I don't use any modes. I just get a little bit more explicit with my requirements up front, and then I let Codex's bias towards research guide us towards a pseudo plan that we get at the end of our chat discussions. Usually it'll go off and research the latest libraries and how my code base works so we can reach a decision on what to build in chat without having a planning document as part of it. Although you could certainly ask it to write down as Markdown. I've also found that rather than jumping to a working solution that has edge cases, Codex really thrives on just working sequentially through tasks, ideally with test-driven development, because once it knows its destination, it's able to get there with very high-quality code. So I'm a bit less ambitious with the scope of everything I ask it to build. I just ask it to kind of ramp through each of the steps we QA together or use playwright test or other means to test that work, and then we do some cleanup at the end before we pull request or merge a feature. I invite you to experiment with more of a Claude Code style in Codex to see if it works for you, since they do offer a planning mode. But I've found that to get the highest success, really hold it and bring as much of your engineering knowledge as you can to the table, because Codex is a very smart model when you hold it in that way. With that, try migrating your Claude Code setup to Codex and see what you find. And this stuff literally changes every week, so if you discover something new, just put it in the comments so we can learn from it. With that, I'll see you in the next video.